What I realized is that if we don't cultivate and develop leaders in this organization, we are going to be limited in how far we can take this organization.
Howdy, Travis from KnowHow here. Welcome to the Restoration Playbook Podcast, where the KnowHow team sits down with industry experts to talk about how you can build a world-class workforce. Today, we're talking with Mark Springer. He's the founder of ORTIS Advisors and the past CEO of Dayspring Restoration, as well as the past president of the Restoration Industry Association. I'm really excited to dive into this conversation with Mark, where he talks about leadership and talks about strategy. But before we get into this high impact conversation with Mark, I want to share three things with you. First, if you want more insights like the ones that you hear today in our conversation with Mark Springer, I think you'll love our new book, Building Leaders. You can get a hard copy for yourself on Amazon or your own digital version completely free at buildingleadersbook.com. Secondly, if you say, hey, I would love to get the insights of people like Mark Springer and Ben Looper, Marcy Richardson, over a dozen industry experts into my ears because I don't have time to sit down and read a book, well, we got you covered because we have an audiobook version of Building Leaders as well. And it's super easy to get your hands on it. We've released it as a podcast, one episode for each chapter. So wherever you're listening to this podcast, look up Building Leaders book. We'll link it in the show notes, and you can listen to the audiobook version of Building Leaders as well. Again, completely free. Last, I just want to give you a quick word on what KnowHow is in case you are not familiar. KnowHow is your tool to rapidly onboard and upskill your staff and give on-demand expert guidance for whatever task they have to do next. We use the power of artificial intelligence combined with your company's standard operating procedures to make sure that your staff always have the information they need to work competently and confidently out on the job site. It's a desktop app, it's a mobile app. We use AI in a bunch of incredible ways to give employees answers, dynamic answers in the language that works best for them based on your company's proven methods. It's really something else. It's making a huge dent in the restoration industry and equipping companies all across North America to work more competently and confidently. If you want more information, head to tryknowhow.com. All right. So with all of that said, we're going to dive into this conversation with Mark. It's super fascinating. So let's jump right in.
Hi, my name is Mark Springer. I'm the former owner of Dayspring Restoration and the not immediate past, but nearly past president of RIA, the Restoration Industry Association. Now the principal and founder of ORTIS Advisors, which does assistance to entrepreneurs in scaling and preparing businesses for potential exits. Excited to talk today a little bit about my philosophy of leadership and how I view this important topic.
Awesome. Hey, Mark, I really appreciate you joining us. I'm excited for this discussion. Some of the topics we're going to dive into, including the cost of not building leaders and just how that can impact the company, as well as how to bridge generational gaps and think strategically. But maybe to kick things off, Mark, I'd love for you just to give us a bit of a background on how you got into restoration. And even in your intro, you provided a few exciting chapters along the way. But how did you get to the place where you're at today?
Well, it's certainly a trajectory and a story of grace for sure. You and I were talking a little bit before we started recording about grace, but I was very blessed in my life to grow up in a great family in Missoula, Montana. Montana is like all the rage now. Ever since these shows have come out, like Yellowstone and stuff, people want to come to Montana. And I think COVID as well. COVID was a big impact for people moving to Montana. But I grew up in Montana before it was cool. And of course, I thought it was cool then, but not as cool as everybody thinks it is now. My dad started Dayspring Restoration when I was about 11 years old. So I grew up in the business, saw the business in a bunch of different stages, a bunch of different forms. But like I said, we were very blessed to be able to grow the business really across the big state. Montana is a large state geographically with a low population, but we ultimately established 7 offices across Montana. And then in 2020, sold our company, and it became the initial first platform company in fleet response, which now is a national restoration company that is across the United States. And then after 3 years in that roll up process, the end of last year, stepped away from that. Now in a season of life where I'm spent a little bit more time with my family. I got 5 daughters that are all amazing girls. They're starting to get married now, so I'm stroking a lot of checks for weddings over the last couple years. But spent a little bit more time with them, and then now providing some guidance and just sharing areas from my experience that help people in either building their organization to prepare it either for scaling and value acceleration, or even potentially an exit. And so that's where I'm at now.
Mark, when Dayspring started, obviously it would have been just your dad at the helms, and so
You're right.
the leader of the company, also went by the title of father, and probably a few other titles as well. And then as the
Well,
company continued to grow, I mean, clearly there's a culture of building leaders at Dayspring because you became a part of that leadership. But I'm curious, how did you think about identifying who those leaders and potential leaders are at Dayspring? And like, how did you go from identifying, hey, there's opportunity here, I see some good character qualities, to having that person step into the potential that you really saw in them as a leader?
so I think I'd have to even step back just a little bit, Travis, from that, because I think most of what shapes us as leaders and what shapes our organizations often are our failures
Hmm.
and the times that we've set out to do something and it does not go according to plans, right? And we really have at that point when we come to these inflection points where things are not going well, we have a choice, right? I mean, we can either double down on the mistakes that we're making and really hurt ourselves and a lot of times the people around us, or we can learn from these experiences, and we can really take that opportunity when things don't go well to be able to reflect, improve, and then reshape, recalibrate where we're going. And I think early in my career, as we were really growing the company, before I was able to talk to people about and really cast vision to them about what they needed to be as leaders, I had to really do that for myself. I really had to step back and had to study, and I really went on a journey of really what leadership is and what is required to be someone who others will follow. We all have these different markers throughout our lives where we come into contact with either a really bad leadership experience where, something so disaffects us that, it could harm us as humans, right? We can become bitter, we can become resentful. There's a lot of things that negatively can happen. And then there's other cases where we come into contact with people who are just exceptional leaders. And I had come to a point where I realized I was focused on the fact that I was not the man I needed to be, and that I was going to need to go on a journey to understand what really the fundamental foundational concept of leadership are that would enable me to be able to build a company that would attract other leaders, develop other leaders, inspires others to become a part of what we were doing. And so as I started on this journey, I just started devouring all these leadership books. And initially, Travis, I was disappointed, I guess, right? Because I think
Hmm.
a lot of the bestsellers on leadership are, these stories from a military general or, a sports coach or a celebrity CEO, and they're not relatable. there are these cases you're like, okay, I'm not going to probably be in a case where we need to storm the beaches of Normandy. I'm not probably, I'll use a Canadian example. I'm probably not going to be competing for the Stanley Cup here, right? Um, or these other celebrity geared or oriented leadership examples. So what I initially kind of found disappointing, and I ultimately started talking to and just interviewing people that I really respected, and I started asking them, what shaped you as a leader? What were the important milestones in your journey, in your life, that helped you to become the person that got you to where you are today? And then I started asking them, what were the resources that mattered to you? And so at that point, I was able to pivot, really sort of understand what their framework was, how they looked at leadership, and then found some great resources. One of the great ones that has really shaped a lot of my philosophy is a book called The Leadership Challenge by Jim Kouzes and Barry Posner. And what an invaluable resource for developing your own leadership skills. And it really wasn't until I started to develop some of myself as a leader that I then was able to start thinking about how investing in others made sense.
And Mark, what I hear you saying in that is, and actually, I remember when I was like a young single guy, I was like, I'd like to get married in the next few years. And the question I asked myself was, well, if I want to get married, I should probably figure out what it looks like to be marriage material. And I hear you
Yeah,
saying the same thing, right? Which, hey, if I want to
that's
be
right.
a leader, I need to first become leadership material. And
That's right.
how do I go about doing that? And it's awesome that we just didn't like, oh, well, this is what, this ex-army guy says, so I'm going to do that. But you looked at the people that you respected and said, well, hey, I can attest to the fact that you're a good leader because you
Yeah.
have had, a leadership impact in my life. And so
Mhm.
I would love to hear from you how you got to where you are. And that's actually a lot of the vision behind this book and this interview,
Yeah.
right? Is that next
Right.
generation of leaders standing on the
Yeah.
shoulder of leaders that have come before them.
Yeah.
What I hear you saying in all of this, Mark, is there's not a clear, straight road to becoming a good, effective leader, and there's lots of opportunities to fail.
Yeah.
And I think that some potential leaders might see all the like failure points along the way. It's, I could screw things up. I could say the wrong thing. I could lead someone in a bad direction. And so I'm very nervous to begin to try to cultivate leaders in our organization, maybe because I don't think that I'm an excellent leader myself.
Right.
What I want to highlight is actually there's a failure there too.
Right.
To
Yeah.
fail to create that next generation of leaders is maybe even more dangerous. And so help me understand the consequences of failing to create leaders in your organization and failing to kind of step up to the task of being a leader that builds leaders.
You know, well, I think it's a great question and a good insight. I think that, what I realized is that if we don't cultivate and develop leaders in this organization, we are going to be limited in how far we can take this organization. In any case where an organization is going to be able to have success, where it's going to be able to advance in its marketplace, it's going to directly correlate to the quality of the leaders within that organization. I mean, the individual can only get it so far. If you don't have leaders in the respective business functions that are required for it to be successful, you're going to be hamstrung in how far that business can go and how much it can scale. And so, really, that's just the reality that every entrepreneur, every leader faces. Is that if I don't develop the leaders around me, if I don't develop this team, it's going to stop. I'm only going to get it so far. And then the second reality is that if we don't develop these leaders, they're going to leave. They'll go somewhere else. They will not continue to be part of this organization because at some point, quality leaders are drawn to leaders that they respect and that inspire them. And so if we can't be that, if we can't institutionalize that in our culture, then the people we need to be successful are going to go provide that in another organization.
So, Mark, what I had picked up you saying was that if we don't cultivate leaders properly, we're going to be limited as an organization. And like, what I'm hearing is like, as the existing leader, the organization's ceiling becomes my ceiling unless I
Yeah.
can create that next generation of leaders. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think every leader, Maxwell, who of course was a big leadership guru,
Mm-hmm.
talked about this concept of a leadership lid. Everyone has a point at which they sort of get to their maximum potential. Well, the reality is that ceiling is low if we're not willing to invest in ourselves. So, there's always a point at which someone could be like, I want to be president of the United States of America. Well, you probably don't. That's probably not going to be your reality. But wherever we can take an organization, that can be dramatically expanded based on how much we're willing to invest in ourselves and how much we're willing to be outside of our comfort zone. Most of the things that I've learned about leadership over the years have come through my mistakes
Hmm.
or through the failures that I've had. The key difference is, do we take those mistakes, do we take those failures and then improve and advance as an individual? Or does it become sort of the Achilles heel that limits our ability to grow any further?
I want to have a quick detour around this topic of investing in yourself. It wasn't necessarily on the agenda for us to talk about, but you've brought it up a few times, Mark, and I couldn't agree more. You can't lead others until you can lead yourself. And so, how would you advise someone who sees themselves becoming a leader, but they don't know where to start? Maybe they don't have the confidence that their leadership material. You talked about your own process of, you know, finding which books kind of resonated with, what you felt leadership was and which didn't, talking to some of those mentors and leaders that had really had an impact on you. How
Yeah.
else, like, what other steps would you say are there for someone to get their own house in order first before they can really start to lead others?
Yeah. So there's a couple practical things that anyone can do. The first sort of goes hand in hand with speaking with and getting advice from other leaders who've been successful. In that context, a lot of times leaders are very busy people. So, you can't always get them. I remember as I was interviewing all these people when I was very young, I mean, I was in my early 20s. And, there were a lot of gracious people who agreed to take, an hour and visit with me about, what had shaped them as a leader. But at some point, there's only so much time that kind of give
Mhm.
a, 22-year-old or whatever. But I did find several people who were able to mentor me throughout my lifetime. So I always think there's a lot of wisdom. One of the things that stuck with me early from one of the mentors I had, he said, you should always look to be mentored and be mentoring. At whatever stage you are of life, being mentored by someone with wisdom will help really shortcut some of the traps that we can find ourselves falling into. And it can help us really accelerate that journey by not making sometimes the mistakes that they made. We still need to make mistakes. Inevitably, some of it still happens, but maybe the nature at which the pain associated with those hits us may be diminished. But then the other side about mentoring someone else, even if you're young, is that's really what sets in our minds and really anchors in our thinking the principles and the practices we're trying to learn. In the medical world, when they start teaching medical students, there's apparently this concept of see one, do one, teach one. So as the medical students are going through their process, they watch someone who is an expert performing a procedure. Then they do it with their own hands. That's the second step of learning. And then the final step of learning is actually teaching this to someone else. because now you are required to articulate what you have seen and now done. And that really, again, catalyzes that in our minds differently, right? And so I think that's an important step as someone's seeking to develop themselves. It may just be that if you're a young professional, that you're mentoring someone who's a high school student who aspires to one day be in business, right? There's a lot of opportunities. You might think, so who would ever want to be mentored by me? But there's always those opportunities. And then maybe the second thing that I would suggest, Travis, would be to get an honest assessment of where you are today. There's a lot of good assessment tools. One of the ones that I found tremendous value in was called the Leadership Practices Inventory, LPI. To do this, you not only have to assess yourself and be honest about where I'm at and really what are the things that I'm struggling with now, but then in this LPI, you also could do this as a 360, and you can have other people in your circle give anonymous feedback as to how your behaviors are affecting their performance. And if you're willing, these things are very humbling to review. I remember the very first time I go in these, I'm like, do I really do that? Like, I don't think I do that. But like everyone's saying you do that. So you have to be honest with yourself and be willing to see and have these blind spots. All of us as leaders have blind spots, just these things that we don't realize that we're doing that affect others' behavior or performance. And if we can't address those, we are always going to be limited in the trajectory of our leadership. And so those would maybe be just two. I mean, there's a lot of things that we could talk about, but those are two that really stick out to me. One is, finding a mentor and mentoring someone else. And the second is have a realistic view of where you are as a leader today.
And I think that's such a good transition point to this topic of cultivating the next generation of leaders, because, hand in hand with being mentored, like you said, is you got to start mentoring people. And so ideally, a leader in an organization right now is trying to identify who are those individuals that I think I could begin mentoring to become a leader. And I don't have to have all the lessons figured out. I could be the teacher that just tries to stay one lesson ahead of the student to make sure, they can teach it properly. But walk me through, how would you advise that leader to have that conversation with a potential next generation leader? Hey, I see some leadership qualities in you. I want you to come alongside me. Like, how would you encourage or coach someone to identify those people and then join them on that leadership journey?
Well, I think, again, stepping back in this, we have to recognize the status quo today, right? And as I have worked with not only leaders in the organizations that I've been involved with or I've been a leader in, but even as I've worked with and now advised others in other organizations, as I step back and look at these organizations and as an outsider, here's the reality that I see time and time again. And that is that in our society today, the norm is that very few individuals have ever had anyone invest in them as a leader. And I'll ask people, right? I mean, when they're new to our organization and they're early in their journey, I'll ask them, who are the leaders that impacted you? What are some examples you could share with me about someone who invested in you or what in kind of this methodology of the leadership challenge I talked about, what would be an example of a personal best that you observed where someone's leadership skills were on display? And you know what usually happens, Travis? I get just a blank deer in the headlights look, right? So it's sad, but the reality is we live in a culture and in a society that is moving so fast, that is so self-absorbed. I mean, everything is sort of about, what can I do to improve my future or what's in it for me, rather than really the perspective that organizations, I believe, need to have if they're going to have success in this, which is really servant leadership. What does it mean to serve the others around me as a leader. So I think we just very first have to recognize that we deal with this challenge as a societal norm. But that being said, we have an enormous opportunity because I believe this: young people crave being part of something bigger than themselves. In fact, as they've had all these surveys with the, millennial generation, it was like everywhere you went, every conference you went to there, 10 years ago, it was, how do you deal with the millennial generation? And now it's the iGen, right? Or the iPhone generation, the next generation, my kids' generation. And it's the same thing with both generations. They crave to have two things. One is deep connection in an era and in a societal norm of superficial interaction, where the interaction that's happening is on social media, where it is curated in a way that is not authentic. It is not genuine. It's for selfies. It's for clicks. It's for views. It's for viral impressions rather than genuine, transparent, deep, lasting connection. And I believe this, and I find it time and time again that this next generation craves this, but simply we have to begin with spending the time and investing the time, because in our mindset, we embrace the idea that developing the next generation of leaders is critical, not only for the success of our organization, but critical for our legacy as human beings, right? So some of the things, I'll tell you this just happened to me recently, a couple weeks ago. And I don't say this to say something like, oh, this is so great for me. I just shared this as like, this really meant a lot to me. This gave me the warm fuzzies all over, right? I had a man who worked in our organization for 5 or 6 years, came in as a carpenter, elevated quickly to a superintendent, and then an ops manager, and then a general manager. Really over about a 4 or 5 year period of time, we just invested a lot in him. All of our leadership team invested in him, and ultimately left our organization. He's actually in another state right now. So I have no economic benefit from his involvement now. But he sent me a text about 2 weeks ago. I wish I'd pull it up on my phone right now, but it'd be super distracting. So I'm just going to sort of give you the highlights. But basically he said this: Mark, where I am today, what I'm doing in the company that I'm pursuing today, and it's actually his own company, I would not be able to do had I not had the investment that you and the leadership team at Dayspring put into me. And this has happened to me dozens of times. I've had people who are not in our organization, they come back to me and they say, Mark, when I worked at Dayspring, we didn't do glamorous things, right? We extracted water out of carpet, we cleaned smoke off of walls. We wore full personal protective equipment and HEPA vacuum mold spores out of crawl spaces. But in the midst of that, I learned an enormous amount about what it means to be a good employee. I learned about what it means to have a good work ethic. And ultimately, in learning those things, I was able to grow into a place of leadership. And the investment that this company made into me has bettered my journey as a human being. Now, that means more to me than the EBITDA that we generate. It means more to me than the success and the accolades and all the other stuff. That to me is the stuff that anchors and establishes our legacy as people. And that's what I find the most joy in.
And Mark, what I hear you saying in this is that there might be leaders in an organization that maybe they are well aware of their faults and failures and feel like they would not be the idealized version of a leader that they have in their mind. But what young people are looking for right now is not necessarily that ideal version of a leader that, fits some 1980s archetype. What they're looking for right now is someone that cares about them, that's willing to invest in them, and bring them along for something that's bigger than themselves. And that's something that anyone can do starting now. Is that right?
That's right. Absolutely. I mean, I think that, again, it gets to the earlier point that I was just talking about. In a superficial, very entitled culture that we have, I believe that human beings crave a genuine connection. They crave, someone to be able to be genuine and real with them rather than fake and scripted. And so I think that in that context, again, there's enormous opportunity today, because when leaders will do that, when they'll simply be truthful and real, and I think our best teaching opportunities are in the midst of our own failures. Now, this stuff could be, I suppose a leader could overdo it. You could just be someone that's like, oh, I screwed up again today, and ultimately the person like, this guy has no credibility, right? I mean, I don't know if I really want to follow him. All he does is screw up. But,
Hmm.
if you have established your company, if you've established your role, often we have this sense like we have to be perfect and that no one can ever see me screw up because they're not going to trust me anymore. But it's actually in the midst of this that I think that our humility and our honesty and our ability to be genuine can provide the best opportunities for us as authentic leaders to not only teach the people who are coming alongside with us, but also to really establish the sense of loyalty and within our teams, that people know this guy isn't perfect. I don't have to be perfect because I know I'm not perfect. But in this place, there's safety for me to walk in this journey and to be able to grow. Because again, the only way we're going to grow as leaders is through mostly our mistakes. And if that's a safe place where we can grow together, there's going to be a lot more rapid growth as a leader when we can embrace that than if we're doing it in a superficial manner.
Hmm. In the midst of all of this leadership development, uh, and just the day to day of the job, one thing that can be forgotten is the strategic element of the business as well. Hey, what are our larger goals? Are we heading towards them? Are we on the right path to hitting these goals? I want to take some time to talk about the strategy side and strategic planning, gathering people around a strategic vision at your company. I think this is another thing that you and Dayspring did really well. But I guess at a high level, if someone's listening to this and they're like, time for strategy, I'm just trying to keep up with all these new jobs that are coming in. How
Mhm.
how did you guys think about that? Did you have like strategic planning retreats when you put your phones on silent? Was there some sort of cadence involved? How did you balance just the ever competing priorities of day-to-day tasks to do, of which there are many and fires to put out, and ensuring that as leaders you are taking the company in the right direction?
Great question. I think, first of all, it's important that we don't bifurcate leadership development from strategy.
Hmm.
Leadership development is a strategy. It's something that requires a great deal of intentionality and time commitment. Developing the leaders in our organization was always a critical building block in our overall strategic plan. Now, as it relates to strategic planning, I think there's a couple things that are important. I mean, the very first one is you must plan, you must strategize if you're going to be successful. It's interesting. One of the first things that I'll ask a lot of organizations when I start to work with them is, could you provide me a copy of your most recent strategic plan? A lot of times organizations don't have that. To your point that you mentioned just a second ago, they're so busy in the grind of the business. They spend all of their time working in the business rather than working on the business, right? And they've heard that cliche, working in rather than on. But the strategic planning is one of the most important pieces of the working on element, right? The challenge, I think, that where I think a lot of leaders and owners and entrepreneurs have missteps with strategic planning is they will allocate time for strategic planning, and then we'll go off site and everyone works on this. Sometimes they'll hire a facilitator, or sometimes they use some sort of framework, and then they do nothing with it. They get done with it, and everybody ends on a Saturday at lunch. And by Monday morning at 8 o'clock, that strategic planning is just a figment of their distant imagination. And that's where we miss the opportunity, not only to catalyze our own efforts as leaders and really to provide very tangible steps in leadership, but also we start to really cause some cynicism, I think, amongst our teams, because they go, oh, here we are for the strategic planning session. We're going to get together. We're going to talk about a lot of this stuff, and we're never going to do it. And we build into our culture this experience of not achieving our goals, of not accomplishing what we set out to do. So I think a couple of things are really critical as organizations think about strategic planning. One is you have to do it, number one. The second thing is you need a framework for this. Now, there's a lot of different frameworks. There's a couple that I've used that were very helpful. One was the Scaling Up One-Page Strategic Plan, OPSP. That's a great way to really lay out the strategy for the organization in something that is just a snapshot of where we need to go. There's a lot of companies that are using the EOS model now, which is, the traction Gino Wickman methodology. That one's good as well. I think Scaling Up there's some nuances between the two. There's some things that I still really, really like about Scaling Up, even though I think a lot of people are moving toward the EOS because it's a little more approachable, a little easier. I don't think it really matters if you just pick one and then use it consistently. And this is what separates the companies that accomplish things on their strategy and the ones who just have the idea of success. They want to be successful, they just don't do the work to actually get it done. And that is the pursuit of relentless execution. And this means that if we're going to set out and build a strategic plan using whatever framework it is that we're going to use, we are going to make sure that this becomes a part of the way that we as leaders function. And we're going to make sure that we break the strategic plan, which might be 3 or 5. I don't think there's a ton of value in going beyond 5 years. Might be good to talk a little bit about it, but really 5 years. I mean, past that, we can't, there's a whole bunch of stuff we can't control, right? But once we have these 3 to 5 year thrusts that really are going to guide our organization, okay, now we've got to break this down into what must be accomplished this year. And then break it down to the next piece beyond that, which is what are the rocks? I think both the EOS and Scaling Up refer to these things as rocks. What are we going to do over the next 90 days that we're going to commit ourselves to, again, within this relentless execution framework, to make sure that every quarter in, quarter out, we are moving the needle in this organization. And this is what I think is really where the magic happens. It's blocking that time every single quarter to be able, as a leadership team, to hold each other accountable to making that progress. If you do that over time, I promise you'll have success. But what I find most often happens is strategic plans develop, sits for a year, nothing happens. That's where the failure happens.
I just want to double click on that quote that you had, which is pursuit of relentless execution. And I think in alignment where you in alignment with your strategic priorities, that is a formidable company that knows where it's going and is ruthlessly focused on executing on it. I'm curious, help the rubber hit the road for me with this. Can you give an example of where you defined clearly, strategically, hey, this is what we're going to do, and then in that execution, you had an opportunity come up or a question, or there was just, should we go left or should we go right? And because you had done the hard work of defining where we're going, what could have been a very difficult situation to navigate for a leadership team that had not done the work of figuring out strategically what are our priorities, became much simpler for you. Do you have an example that comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing before I go for it, I can't take the credit for relentless execution. There's an awesome book called Execution by Larry Bossidy and Ram Charan. I highly recommend it to anyone. They unpackage over the entire book what relentless execution is. So I don't want to take credit for something that's not really mine. As to the issue of an example of where we had to pivot, you know, a strategic plan has to be utilized within the understanding that we're not always going to be right. But if we fail, we're going to fail not because we failed to plan, right? We set out, we saw an opportunity, we pursued it relentlessly, we executed the best way we could, but either it wasn't the right time in the marketplace, we didn't have the right people, perhaps the opportunity wasn't what we thought it was. But what I find a lot of times are one of two things. One is people refuse to acknowledge that maybe I was wrong. Maybe this wasn't the opportunity I thought it was. And that can really demotivate the other leaders on our team, right? If they see how we just keep putting effort into this initiative that the founder, the owner, Mark Springer thinks this is so important and it's terrible. It was a terrible idea, right? And if we can't just simply acknowledge, I was wrong, we missed on this one, this wasn't right, and now we're going to either provide this amount of time to either continue to pursue, we're going to try these resources, we're going to allocate, we're going to pursue this for this set amount of time, and then we're going to stop, right? We come to these agreements where we can say, okay, at this point, we're not going any further with this. I know we had a number of years ago at Dayspring, we had seen, or I'll take all the credit or the blame for this one, saw this opportunity for adding additional services around home energy audits and building energy efficiency into homes. So we're like, man, we're working in people's homes already. What a great opportunity to take advantage of some of these tax incentives to add solar while we're working here, or do air sealing, or add other geothermal opportunities. I mean, we could add all of this extra revenue while we're already there. And this is going to be a great way for us to be stewards in our communities. And so we made this big investment. And then ultimately, it was just wrong. Like, it took us off course of what really our main business value proposition was in the organization. And we pursued it. We put everything to it. And the leadership team I could tell there was a certain point at which they were like, man, this isn't working, right? But going through that process, we were able to come to a point where we said, okay, we were wrong on this, or I said, I was wrong on this. We're not going to go any further. But the team really participated in that whole decision. I think the other place, to the other side of that, Travis, there are the cases where we have challenges in the business, and without a strategic plan in place, we'll give up too soon sometimes, right? And without us all coming together and just recalibrate and say, okay, we thought that this opportunity was here. It's not hitting the way that we thought it was going to. What do we need to do to meet our goal, right? And that process of, monthly and quarterly reuniting as a team, really coming to consensus about this is the right path. This is the right course. We need to stay focused here. Ultimately, that led to some of our big wins that we had, particularly with some of our satellite offices that we established, right? Because one of the things that Dayspring did well is we had this whole network of companies across Montana, and all of them were profitable. We were able to make sure that they all were hitting on all cylinders. Sometimes as we were launching them, it wasn't that easy. But again, working with a team in a defined strategic plan, we really stayed the course and ultimately have the success that we need.
Here, the stages that you're talking about is like, you need that strategy stage, then you need to commit, you need to execute, and then there's this critical fourth piece, which is to reflect. How's it going? Have those conversations, and that allows you to, in great situations, just get the team on board and get everyone fired up about where you're going. And when things are going poorly, you can have an honest assessment as, are we going in the right direction? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that really buoys the team is that when we would get to the end of the year and we would look back over all those quarters, all those rocks, everything that was achieved over the course of a year, and then even looking back further over the course of multiple years, this is what really gave us the confidence as a team to continue to push forward in a lot of different things. Because, as entrepreneurs and as leaders, often we compare ourselves against unrealistic standards. It's never good enough for us. We're never getting quite as far as we want to. We're never achieving as much as we think we should be. But when we're able to look back over those periods and be able to see, here's where we were last year, this time last year. Here are the things we set out to do. And here's how we, in a very methodical way, exceeded all of the goals that we set because of our commitment to the goals and the strategic process that we had. Here's where we are today. And that just gives so much. Again, it builds the confidence of the team. And then also just this sense within the organization that when we do something, we set out to win, we will win, right? We're going to give ourselves the best chance of success by following this process. And ultimately, good leaders want to be a part of that. What they don't want to be a part of is the opposite, right? Where there isn't focus, they don't achieve goals, they deal with the same problems over and over, year in, year out, same things, different year. And that, I think, comes full circle, Travis, and we started talking about at the beginning of this discussion, right? How do we attract these leaders? How do we invest in them? This is one of the areas where I think, as you said, the rubber meets the road at the end of the day. Do we achieve what we set out to do or not? Because this is where really true leaders shine.
On that note, I think that it's a great time to move to our final rapid fire questions. I've just got a few for you, Mark. The first one, what are some timeless truths that have really stuck with you, that have helped you as a leader navigate just the ups and downs of leading a company?
Well, I think, one of the ones that is, and I've kind of made some, I guess I kind of referenced it a little bit earlier in the conversation, but, as leaders, we have to be able to understand the importance of follow through. So there was a concept called busy-wid, do what you said you were going to do. And that is, I think, a critical thing that's always stuck with me. I think I've lost more credibility as a leader over the years when you tell someone, I'm going to do this, or I'm going to, this is something I'm going to do, or I'm going to get back to you on this, or whatever these things are that we said we we're going to do. If we don't do that, like that just sticks with people. And so being totally committed to doing what you said you were going to do would be one of the things that I would say is probably one of the timeless ones. Another one would be leave it better than you found it. I think whenever this was something at Dayspring that we always talked about all the time with our teams, when we're working in customers' homes, the way we leave our workspace, the way we leave relationships, all these things, leave it better than you found it. I always talked with them in my years as a RIA president, I always talked about this with our board. How do we, as a board, if we're investing our time and no one's getting paid for this, we're all volunteers, how do we leave this organization? How do we leave this industry better than we found it? And this really is, I think, one of the things, again, that gives us context for our strategic planning. What do we need to do to leave it better than we found it? I think the final thing that always, for me, was ingrained in my mind was a quote from Ronald Reagan. When I was a young guy, I think I was probably in high school or somewhere around there, I went to the Ronald Reagan Museum down in Samimi Valley, California. And he had this plaque. Reagan had this plaque on his desk. And it said something along these lines. I'm probably not going to have this perfectly verbatim, but he said this: there's no limit to what one can achieve if he doesn't mind who gets the credit. And this is something I think as leaders, we have to have fixed in our mind. And that is that, there's a lot of times I think people, again, in this, viral social media society that we live in now, everyone wants there's a lot of online bragging and people want to have relevance and all this stuff. But man, if you can help people achieve what's important to them, it's going to be amazing what can actually be done. And that means that at the end of the day, you're going to do a lot of things that no one's ever going to recognize. They're never even going to know that you did it. But if it's not important for you to have your name in lights and win awards and do all these other things, if you're willing to do it for the right reasons, if you're willing to do it because you can know, and again, this gets back to, I think, what a lot of times people think of as their core values or the faith that they live out in their life, whatever that is. It's like, what am I really here for? And it's not to be served, it's to serve others, right? And so I think that that's always been really important. Something I've even seen in my own life play out, right? It's if you help those folks, it's amazing what they'll do. So those would maybe be three things that have always stuck with me,
Mhm.
in good times and bad, Travis, that I think are timeless.
Similar theme. Last question that I've got for you. What advice or feedback or lesson have you received from a leader that has stayed with you over the years?
So I think it would be something that my dad instilled in me
Mm.
when I was pretty young. I remember when I was young, my dad would offer criticism to me, and sometimes like dads do. Kid, I'm working with him in the business, so I can't avoid this guy. He's
Mhm.
my dad and my boss. And he would sometimes offer criticism about things that I was doing. And a lot of times it's because I'm 14, right? Or 15, you just don't do things right. And I think our natural response a lot of times, just because of, we can be very prideful as human beings, is, we don't want to receive criticism. It's hard to hear when someone offers, even if they say it really nicely and they sandwich the criticism between
Mm.
praise and everything, we still don't want to receive it. But I think it's so important for us to be able to shift in our minds the idea that criticism is an assault to criticism is a gift.
Hmm.
Even if we don't want to hear it, most of the time criticism's offered, there is truth in it. It may not all be true. Someone could be mean-spirited or abrasive in how they're doing it, but there's still probably a nugget of truth in there for us to receive and learn from. And I think if we as leaders can go from seeing criticism as a really as a nasty thing that we don't want to hear to a gift, it can change who we are in our effectiveness and our growth, especially in removing the blind spots. I mentioned earlier, we all as leaders have blind spots. We have blind spots as husbands. We have blind spots as fathers. We have blind spots as business leaders. We don't know them unless they're revealed, usually not by ourselves. We are the worst person to criticize or examine our own performance. So we can
Mm.
receive that as a gift. I think we can make it's a huge opportunity.
Awesome. What I hear you saying is our kids should do a 360 review of us. Is that what you're saying?
Uh, That's so they'll do that without us even ask sometimes,
Involuntary.
especially as they
That's
get older. There's that time when they're in their mid-teens and they pretty much got everything wired. I only know this because that's how I thought when I was 15. Yeah, we'll get a 360 whether we solicit it or not.
that's funny. Mark, I really appreciate this discussion. I think this has been incredibly helpful to understand how do you lead yourself? How can you then identify leaders and call them to leadership and lead them even though you don't have everything figured out? And then how can you lead your company both in the execution and strategically to make the right decisions?
Hmm.
Mark, I appreciate you giving us time today.
Well, thank you, Travis. I think the what you guys are really looking to dive into here is invaluable to restoration leaders or leaders that aren't even in restoration. Anyone who you guys see as the end user of this, I think it's really helpful. And I commend you guys in pursuing this.
All right, that's all for this month's episode. Thanks again to Mark Springer for joining us and unpacking his expertise and perspective forged after decades of experience in the restoration industry. Don't forget, you can head to buildingleadersbook.com for more actionable advice from people like Mark and other highly respected leaders in the industry on how you can ensure your company builds a legacy that outlasts you. And again, check out the audiobook, Building Leaders, available wherever you get podcasts, and we'll have a link in the show notes as well. All right. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next time.